O Tannenbaum, gesungen vom Nebequartett Edison Rekord.
To another edition of the Almost Hour. We're going to be continuing in the festive spirit of yesterday's talk. Actually, kind of continuing on the same riff with a couple of new twists. One thing that I'm going to be doing with my remaining broadcasts for the festive season is trying to relate not only something interesting spiritually, but an interesting tidbit about a particular Hollywood classic, literary classic, Christmas classic, that you may not know as much as you think about, or think as much as you know about. Okay, so before we delve into today's topic, which I'm going to title On Beyond Sea, 12 Ornaments for the First Christmas Tree, an all-father-side chat for budding and bungling El-Chemists of all crafts. We're going to start with talking about a Christmas classic that you're probably pretty familiar with, Ben-Hur. Now, I'm not talking about the Hollywood woke version, that Hollyweird woke version that was released more recently. I'm talking about the classic, Charlton Heston classic, that was based upon a book, one of the great American novels that's not so well publicized as it might ought to be. A novel called Ben-Hur by a fellow named Lew Wallace. Now, Lew Wallace was an interesting character, and you'll see how this ties into today's subject, or all my subjects in general, when I get done telling you about this interesting cat. Lew Wallace was a lawyer who was practicing in Indiana before the Civil War. He ended up being one of the main recruiters for the Union in his state and was appointed a leader, was a fairly successful leader, to the point where he had risen to the rank of Major General, I think it was, coming into the Battle of Shiloh and in command of a pretty sizable number of men. Now, any of you know anything about the Civil War know that the Battle of Shiloh was a very narrowly fought affair, and the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, they say, even more bloody than Gettysburg. Now, Lew Wallace was leading his men in reserve, waiting for orders from Grant on what to do in this battle. And after the battle, which was narrowly won by the Union, but was considered kind of a Pyrrhic victory because of the high number of casualties, Lew Wallace got the brunt of the Union's ire about the high number of casualties. They blamed, in fact, Grant himself blamed Wallace for not bringing up his reserves. When in fact Wallace had said, you know what? I didn't get any orders to bring up my reserves. I was waiting for written instructions. And to which Grant's argument was, well, you shouldn't have to wait for orders. If you're a good commander, you should just jump right in when you see the need. And so he was kind of discredited through all this and ended his military career as a result of it, and went on to become a writer of fiction. Wrote this great novel, Ben-Hur. A lot of good lessons to take from the life of that fellow. One is that I believe that he had a Messiah life. He created something that was very important to a country, that was very important to the divine plan, to what's going on today, to the series of events that conspired to get us to where we are in a long history of interesting coincidences and interesting developments. Illustrates a couple of things. A, nobody's really sure who was right. Was Wallace a coward? Was he maybe just protecting his own men? Seeing that, man, this is going to be horrible. I'm not going to go get my men slaughtered. Or what was going on there? Maybe he was just being a good soldier waiting for orders. And this is a good illustration of the moral hazard of karma. You don't necessarily know what the right solution is. And you've got to make your best call based upon who you are. And that's what Wallace did. And, when he came under fire after that and was made a pariah, he didn't just crawl under a rock and die or move to another country, change his name. He went on to write one of the greatest works of fiction, arguably, of the American legend. So next time you're looking for something to watch, something on the 12 Days of Christmas, I encourage you to pull up the old classic Ben-Hur, the real classic version, the Charlton Heston version, and maybe drink a toast to an unsung messiah of, well, both Christianity and, I would guess, the challenged United States Constitution. Here's to you. Oops, I have something to drink here. Here's to you, Lew Wallace. Okay, on to our real subject. Now, yesterday we talked a bit about the first Noel, the first physical Trinity within the first universes of the Big Bang. Now, some of you are going to think about that, especially, the anal retentive physicists among you, and you're going to say, well, wait a minute. If hydrogen was God's first incarnation in physical reality, what was going on before then? Because hydrogen is made up of quarks, and it has a proton and an electron. In fact, it also has different isotopes that are heavier. It has some isotopes that actually have some neutrons. So even though its atomic number is 1, it's got a lot of interesting nuances that go beyond that. Okay, so, yes, this is true. What were the quarks? The quarks were ideas for creations that were rather ephemeral. That's why we don't see quarks in the wild, unless we make some really wild conditions that allow us to observe their behavior through the particles that they create when they can't be stable as quarks. Okay, so you can think of these as the creative ideas of some of the other souls that chose to come into this game after seeing how much fun it was with the antics of Lucifer and Lilith. The ones who didn't volunteer, the ones who didn't get picked, said, well, I'm going to go play too. And made all sorts of things, some of which were useful and stayed around as quarks. Some collection of those quarks, God decided, you know what? Yeah, let's make this thing called a proton out of some of these quarks. And that was the essence of hydrogen. Anybody who knows anything about hydrogen knows that it doesn't have to have an electron. All it's got to have is a proton to be hydrogen. It doesn't have to have any neutrons. It can, if it's going to be a different isotope. but it doesn't need to. Okay, so actually God was the proton, which is the hydrogen. They're essentially the same thing. Now, where did the electron come from? Well, this was, the proton had a positive charge, at least in the positive universe. The antiproton, of course, had a negative charge in the negative universe. This was considered quite threatening. This looked like a major attack of God jumping into the game, right? And the adversary, Borg, decided, you know what, I've got to send another volunteer in. Go fix things. And that's how the electron was born. You might prefer to call her Electra, of Greek mythology fame. This is another feminine archetype. This is the archetype of the bride of Christ, who is revolving around him, spinning around him in a cloud, an electron cloud, trying to keep God from not getting into too much trouble. And any of you who have experienced a relationship with a henpecking wife kind of know what this aspect of the feminine is like. It's a very loving energy. It wants to embrace you, protect you from yourself. And this, in essence, is where the Borg ideal comes from. The idea that, well, you're not smart enough, you're not responsible enough to have free will, to do what you want. You need me to tell you what to do. This is Borg. This is the hive mind. This is the authoritarian controller that wants to rule your universe, wherever it is. Okay, so that's where Electra came from, electrons. Where did neutrons come from? Well, the electron didn't really stop God. In fact, it just made God work better. Oh man, I got all sorts of new things I can do with the electron. I can send the electrons off to do their own thing, and they have less mass, so they have, you know, other properties of being a particle or a wave, as I choose to have them. And back in those days, there weren't a lot of rules. They were being experimented with. Okay, so after seeing that the secret weapon of Electra didn't work, in fact, Electra was learning to really like this god cat because he gave her a lot of freedom that she'd never had from her boss. So Borg's side decided, you know what, we need to send in another strategy, another secret weapon, and that was the neutron. Well, if we can't conquer God with negativity or positivity, depending on what universe you're in, let's conquer him by overwhelming him with neutrality. And we'll just create all these neutrons that are going to crowd out the protons and the electrons and restore balance to the force. We'll make sure that nobody gets in each other's way by creating this perfectly neutral. Okay, this is a Borg agenda too. The idea that you must neutralize everything, you must make everything one, or separate everything and keep the one between them so the poles don't wipe each other out. This is another way that Borg has tried to shut down creation. Well, it didn't work, of course. It just stimulated more creation. Okay, so that's a little aside on stuff that I might not have covered yesterday. What I want to go to now is talking about what happened next and how it ties to some other important patterns of creation. Now, one of the patterns that happens very often, which you may or may not be aware of, I'm sure you're aware of actually, but you may not quite grok why it's so important, is the pattern of 12. 12 apostles, 12 constellations of the zodiac, the base 12 system that we used to count on when we had 12 fingers. There's a lot of important things that revolve around 12. The 12 tribes of Israel, Israel. That's something I'll have to talk about another time. That's another one that, if you think about it in a modern context, you will see that there's a lot of ways to view that Israel, Israel, is one way to view it. It's a question. Is the sun God? Or you can view it as Isis and Ra are El. In other words, this balance of the male and the female. Isis being the goddess of the moon, and Ra being the god of the sun, and their child being Horus, who is like the mediator, the middleman. This is how trinities work. And this is another pattern that you'll see, the pattern of 3. Okay, so I want to talk about the first 12 of this particular first generation of the gods of creation, incarnation. So we talked about hydrogen and helium, God, the Son, the daughter, divine masculine, divine feminine, Lucifer, Lilith. Well, then comes beryllium and boron, which are, they're important elements, but they're not very special. I'm guessing that these were probably other souls that came in to play the game and happened to come up with a decent idea. And kind of like the quarks, they made their mark on permanent creation in a way that was maybe more substantial than others. Probably the biggest step happened when carbon was created. This is a very, very useful element, as are the next two in line, nitrogen and oxygen. In fact, you can make all sorts of gases with these once you learn how to do chemistry. And lots of other things, graphene, diamonds, etc., etc. Carbon is an incredible invention. And the inventor of carbon is naturally quite proud of that achievement. Then comes fluorine. This was a response. Carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen were pretty useful things that were developed by God's team. Fluorine was kind of a less useful thing, sort of like lithium, that was developed by the Borg side as a counter to all the new things that were happening with carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And somewhere in here came the second Noel. Okay, so once there were 12 elements created by stars, the whole star system was working pretty well, and it was being discovered that it was best when a star stopped burning one thing, that it just exploded, and then if there was enough mass left, it contracted to start burning the next fuel. And this is how generations of stars began to happen. And some souls preferred to play as a star. Some preferred to play as a component of a star or an element that you could make stars from. So that this is the beginning of the two levels, the two poles of playing the game. That started it. But the really interesting stuff is always in the middle. The middle is where God comes in to introduce new soul vehicles. So, you know, with the first 12 apostles, this was an elemental time. And these elementals were very separate. They didn't have chemistry yet. And there wasn't a lot you could do with them. It became boring very quickly. And the family said, hey, this game's no fun anymore. We created these 12 elements and we can make all kinds of interesting stars and throw them at each other, but we're getting kind of tired of that game. Give us something new. So God visited the physical realm and introduced the first molecule. Now, anybody who knows anything about molecules know that you could make with the first 12 elements. By far the most useful one is water. H with two O's. And that was God's incarnation. This next birth in a new generation of creation, showing how to make compounds and giving them the most useful one to work with. Now, of course, all the others started making other things. Oh gosh, we can make gases that are similar to helium that give us an interesting substrate besides helium to gather in. Carbon dioxide, even H2O can be a gas. That's a pretty interesting one, right? And this is where the idea of things having solid state or gaseous state or liquid state came from. And this is the era of elementals. Now, if you know anything about elemental beings, they are beings of fire, air, water, and earth. The earth elementals of this first generation were made up of the metals: sodium, magnesium, beryllium, lithium. The fire ones were made up of energy. And energy was an invention of God. Creative energy has always prefigured in everything. And other forms of energy are just limited manifestations of spiritual energy, the energy of thought. Okay, so the original fire elemental was God. And additional forms of energy transfer, the photons, the electromagnetic fields, etc., are manifestations of spiritual energy. Spiritual energy is what allows souls to communicate, to talk to each other. Okay, and spiritual energy is required to join elements into molecules. Molecules into more complex molecules, and eventually ones that are complex enough to have sort of a life of their own. And this is where the real elementals came from. These were more intelligent creatures that could move and think and act independently. And this became a fun feature of this early universe. You could sort of build these elementals and use them as your toy soldiers, so that you didn't have to go incarnate and do everything yourself, because there was getting to be so much matter, so much energy, it was hard for anybody to keep track of it all. Which I think if you view it that way, you understand just how silly the idea of an almighty, all-powerful creator is. Who would want to micromanage every little thing in even one universe, let alone the multiverse? It's insane. You'd have to be the most anal, mentally disturbed, obsessive compulsive you can imagine to be a god like that. You'd have to be a crazy god. Okay, so these elements and elementals were renowned in story and tale, and they still exist today. And yes, you can incarnate in those. However, they have a lot of limitations. The conditions under which elementals are happy to live are mostly not very consistent with hanging around for long in the latest version of the game. So, water spirits are still fairly common. Air spirits are still fairly common. Earth spirits, well, yeah, I guess they're common, but they don't often come out of the earth. Fire spirits, well, if you can deal in pure spiritual energy, why would you want to work through a fire elemental? It's kind of old technology. Once in a while, yeah, you need to, and if you happen not to have any agents on a certain planet that you can quickly get to do your bidding, well, you might send a cosmic ray, high energy particle, to go do something. And there's a lot of high energy particles hitting our solar system all the time. Most of them are stopped by the sun's natural boundary. And this is something that most people don't realize, is that our planet, our sun, have an electromagnetic boundary that repels a lot of particles that would normally come and do a lot of damage. Now, sometimes events conspire to let those particles through. That's what happens when there's a big solar storm, a big flare from the sun. If it happens to be headed towards the Earth and hits it in just the right manner, it can disturb the magnetic field of the Earth to the point that an EMP occurs, a big pulse of plasma hits that can do a lot of damage. Hasn't for a while. The last big one was the Carrington event, which you can go research. It happened during the early days of telegraph communication and wiped out telegraph communications pretty much all over the modern developed world. It wasn't very hard to replace that because it was very low technology. If a similar event or a bigger one happened today, it could wipe out pretty much every circuit, every smartphone, every TV on the planet, or at least on a good fraction of the planet. And unless your device was hardened to be able to withstand an event that large, you would be basically cast back to the Stone Age overnight. And such events have happened before on this planet to other previous civilizations, other versions of chosen species. This game has been going on a long time. I'm just telling you about an early bunch of Christmas trees. We've had a lot of Christmases on this planet. And a lot of the birth style Christmases and a lot of the death style Christmases. The dark side of God going away for a while, leaving us to our own deserts, saying if we can handle our karma or not, letting us get deep in doo-doo, coming back and deciding what to do about it. And this is the time we're heading into right now. This is what the prophecies all tell us about. No matter what culture they come from, there's a convergence of prophecy that all hits right about now. You've heard about the Mayan calendar, you've heard about the biblical prophecies, you've heard about prophecies of Native American cultures, Aboriginal Australian cultures, Aboriginal African cultures, etc., etc. They all have stories that include some sort of an idea of an event. Now, some will say, will think that it's a cyclical event. It's going to happen again and again and again, no matter what we do. And this is kind of the dark lie that Eastern cults live in, who don't like karma. They don't like reincarnation. They think, well, we've got to escape from that because it's a cycle. It's a never-ending cycle. Well, this is the most fundamental misunderstanding you can have about the nature of the soul. The whole system was set up specifically to allow every soul to have the freedom to develop their own personality, their own specialties, their own value in the multiverse through many incarnations from different perspectives of who they are, what they are, where they could be of value. And I would encourage you. I know that almost everybody, if they were honest, know somebody in their acquaintance, in their family, or themselves who have had a near-death experience. We tend not to want to talk about it because people think we're crazy. I'd encourage you to talk to people that have had interesting psychedelic experiences or experiences in meditation. Find out what their experience was and try to make some sense of it as not just a truth, but as a perspective of a much bigger truth. And if you view spiritual experience that way, instead of coming away with, well, it can only be my God that's right. The Christian God is the only one, the Muslim Allah is the only one, blah, 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 blah. You'll come away with an understanding that there's many perspectives from which to view things from. There are many gods and goddesses that have been created by thought, by human thought. Yes, it's true. We create our own gods. Isn't that wonderful? And in fact, by creating those gods, we distribute the chore of keeping the universe, keeping the multiverse running amongst all those gods. Rather than concentrating every bit of power, every decision into one, we distribute it. And this first 12 ornaments on the first Christmas tree were one of the early generations of that. Now, of course, there's a lot more elements than that. But once the first 12 were created, making any more elements was kind of old hat. So God didn't play that game anymore. He started playing the chemistry game, giving some pointers, some hints on how to do chemistry, and letting his family take over from that and develop all of the other compounds, elements, etc., that they wanted, and see how they could make them useful. Out of that, you can make, out of those first 12, what kinds of things can you make? You can make pretty much any kind of hydrocarbon, right? What's a hydrocarbon? Oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Hydrogen. Hydrogen, yeah, I don't know if there's 4 or 3. Maybe hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. I forget. It's been a long time since I took chemistry. You can create all kinds of gases, some poisonous, some useful for certain chemical reactions. You can create basic metals, not real strong ones. I think there's some forms of manganese that are not too bad. You can create life of a sort. You can create DNA. You can't do a lot with it because there's not a lot of things you can do with only those 12. But if you start using the other elements, you can figure out that there's some other really useful ones that were developed that turn into some really great stuff, like iron. Let's see, where does that fall? Element 26, calcium, another great one. Potassium. Well, some of them not so great. Arsenic. That's kind of the nature of creation. A lot of things are dual-use technologies. The most dangerous things ever created tend to be created by the Borg team as a counter-weapon to God's team. And this is essentially how the battle in heaven has continued through all creation. And that battle will keep on going. It's a creative battle, and it's not a bad thing, because you can't have creation without conflict. If everything was perfect, nobody would want to do anything. It's already perfect. I'll just sit back on my ass and strum on my harp and sing praises to the Creator. That's not heaven. I'm sorry. That may be Borg heaven. That may be what you want heaven to be like. And there are universes that are like that, where that's what heaven is like. You can sit around and sing your praises to your Borg master forever. And they will milk your spiritual energy and use it for whatever they want to do. This is how dark matrix universes work. The heavens of dark gods, they know better than you. They give you a little fantasy world, whatever you happen to dream of, and feed the fantasies. Try to maximize the energy that they get out of it. They take your spiritual energy and they use it to further their agenda in the battle. That's one way of approaching creation. It's not the most karmically pure way. It's a very sinful way to approach creation. It says the end justifies the means. I can use or abuse or whatever any souls I can get under my command and send them into battle like Grant wanted Lew Wallace to do with his soldiers, without any concern about their lives, without even stopping to think about, is this necessary? Is this a necessary sacrifice to make for what I believe in? And some sacrifices are necessary. Some battles do need to be fought. In fact, if you walk away from a battle, could well get bigger. As we found out in World War II, if you talk to your grandparents, great-grandparents maybe now, and find out about what was up with World War II, you will find that what happened was, after World War I, everybody was so horrified by the mass death in the trenches, the use of chemical weapons, biological weapons, the first really major weapons of mass destruction, that everybody thought, we can never have a war again. And they literally did anything to try to avoid a war, even though folks like Hitler and the Chinese imperial staff, it wasn't really the emperor, it was actually the oligarchy that ruled the emperor, that really ruled Japan, and had this nice little guy as a figurehead. And they had a very selfish agenda. a very narrow-minded agenda, and they wanted power. Now, that's not to say that the other powers of World War II didn't want power. Certainly the British and the Americans and the French wanted power. They'd been struggling for it for a long time. But the ones who were really the bad guys of World War II, and one of those allies was a bad guy, Russia. Most of you don't remember anything but, well, Russia was our ally. Oh, those communists, they won the war for us. They conquered Hitler while we were sitting back in America and England, resting on our laurels. This is bullshit. This is Marxist bullshit. The truth is that you probably aren't aware of was that after Hitler had overrun most of Europe, he made a deal with Stalin to carve up Poland. Or had overrun, the easy targets like Czechoslovakia, Austria, etc. His next ambition was Poland, and to do that, he made a deal with Stalin to carve it up. And both Nazi Germany and Communist USSR carved the shit out of poor little Poland, which is what started World War II. It wasn't Western aggression, it wasn't England, it wasn't the United States, it was Germany and Russia. Now, of course, part of World War II was already going because the Japanese were already doing everything in their power to try to conquer China, which is the place in Asia that they thought they'd most be able to get away with their ambitions without stirring the anger of America, which was the other major power in the Pacific. This is truth of geopolitics. If you have any other idea of how World War II went down, you are a cult Marxist. And there's a lot of that going around, reimagining history with a new narrative that sells a new dog food. And it's not helpful. It's not patriotic. No matter what country you are, it's not good to lie, to distort the truth, to change history, to suit your political agenda. And there's a lot of that going on. And it's not going to stop until we start remembering the real history. Yes, the victors do write a lot of the history books, but they don't write all of them. That is complete bullshit. You can find the truth in any period of history. Case in point, this Civil War, since we're kind of on that theme, you can find writers of both sides. You can find newspapers of towns of both sides who will tell you of the atrocities and war crimes of both sides, the mistakes and the foibles and the flaws of both sides. They will tell you that there were many people on the Union side that didn't want to have a revolution, didn't want to go fight the South. Go ahead and let them split off if they want to. That's their right. That's a state's right. And there were others that fell on the other side of saying, well, if we let one state go, we're going to have to let them all go. And we're fighting that same battle today. You've got many people that want to split. And you know what? You're being encouraged to do that by cult Marxists, by the people who are the real enemies of your country, who are sowing discord and discontent and unhappiness and letting you blame each other instead of blaming the ones who are spreading that discord, who are creating it with their economic policies, creating it with their fake news narratives, their commercial news spin, the PR of the elite, which include the elite of the US, of the UK, of Russia, of China, of every country in the world, because power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is why, if you believe in an almighty ruler of the universe, you are a worshiper of power. You are a worshiper of anti-God. Anti-God is Borg, the entity that wants to control everything, that wants to automate everything, that wants to turn everything into a program that it controls. And if you're not going to do anything else during this holiday, start talking about basic issues like that. Because I think you're going to find a lot of agreement if you just drop this nonsense of left, right, center, Democrat, Republican, blah, blah, blah. East, West, oppressor, oppressed, indigenous. What the hell is indigenous anyway? You want to give the world back to the first 12 elements because they were the first? Let's give it all back to hydrogen. Let's turn everything to protons. You could probably do that with a big enough bomb. Give everything back to God. That would be the fair thing to do. I'm sorry if I'm raining on any parades with this message. It's sometimes necessary to be the squeaky wheel at the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas feast, and to remind people what's really under the tree of life. At any rate, I think we've done a good job of covering the subject at hand. Like, share, subscribe, question, discuss. That's how I got to where I'm telling you the stuff I'm telling you. I just didn't pull it out of my ass. I thought about it a lot. I thought about all the alternatives. I thought about what would fit all of the evidence. Not only scientific evidence, but spiritual evidence, because spiritual things are scientific too. And I hopefully have done a good job of convincing you that thought creates matter, not the other way around. At any rate, tune in again to the Omnist Hour. Until I see you again, this is Rob Trump, and happy karma.